Good morning, good evening to our listeners. This is a brand new episode of the Chicken Box. I'm your host, Jay. Unfortunately, Impeccable is not here this week, but we are going to try to move forward and see what we can do on our own. So this week we have a special guest, a Mr. Maurice Hicks. He is a 20-year veteran of the Baltimore City police force. So we're going to talk about him or talk with him and his new book, Looking for Trouble. But before we start that, I just want to give a little shout out to the Afro. This is, we just passed our 132nd birthday as the oldest Black newspaper in the country, which is pretty amazing. That date was just August 13th. It's a lovely birthday anniversary for the Afro. Pretty amazing, considering news media has been around for a very long time, but Black media does not get nearly the credit that it certainly deserves. So I just want to make that known. And now let's talk to Mr. Maurice Hicks about his book, Looking for Trouble. Okay, how you doing, Maurice? Thank you for joining us.
I'm doing well, Jay. Thank you very much for having me.
All right. Now, I have to say, the cover of your book looks like an Alex Cross style book. This is like, the great stories of a storied career in police law enforcement. So I was super interested immediately when seeing this because those are the kind of novels I like. So and this being a true story makes it even that much better. So thank you for joining us. Now, as I mentioned in the beginning, you had a 20-year career in Baltimore City and in Prince George's County, which are two very serious places to do law enforcement. Can you talk about that?
Absolutely. It was my time began in 1980s in the height of the crack cocaine epidemic and PCP. So it was a lot of high pace action, a lot of skirmishes in high-rise projects and dealing with people addicted to crack cocaine and PCP.
Yeah. It's unbelievable. So I've got a lot of very interesting questions for you. So the book is sort of a summation of your career, but I have to imagine this is kind of the tip of the iceberg, right? It's like there's only so many stories you can tell and so many perspectives and these kind of things. What do you want people to, after they read your book, what do you want them to come away with ultimately from the story?
Well, one of the things is see the humanity behind the badge. A lot of people think that police are basically robots and they don't have feelings and emotions. And the book really goes into detail about what we're experiencing as we go through trying to rein in the crime and the violence that is being, wreaking havoc on the community. And we, take it very personal. It doesn't end at the end of the day when you go home. It's a commitment, it's a lifestyle, and it's a calling for many of us.
Yeah. And you talk about this idea of it being there being a conflict between sort of your upbringing and then having to be in this world. You're talking about it being a calling. Can you sort of bridge the gap between those things? I'm sure you were not a kid. At least it sounds like you were not a kid in this, and you were spending your entire life avoiding being into this world. Like, what is the calling that you got from that?
Well, for me, I grew up in Baltimore watching people shooting up heroin right in back of where I lived.
Right.
And I never dreamed that I would ever be involved in law enforcement. And something happened when I was 11 years old that really took its toll on me. And as these guys were shooting up heroin like they did pretty much every day, they raided my neighbors. They burglarized my neighbor's home when I was 11 years old. And I watched them as they came back with the property. And one of the kids showed me his gun and told me, motioned me to be quiet. And a couple minutes later, my mentor came home and she asked me a critical question. She said, "Did you see anything?" And I hesitated for a moment. And I said, no. I said, no, because I was terrified, number one. I was afraid. But there was a code that we grew up with to never snitch on anybody.
Right.
And this troubled me for years. It really, really bothered me that I didn't tell my mentor what happened to her, to her property. Fast forward 10 years later, I go down with my cousin who wants to join the Baltimore Police Department. Had no interest in law enforcement whatsoever. And the long story short, I ended up joining. He didn't.
Oh, wow. Interesting.
Almost 10 years, close to the day, I'm walking foot patrol in O'Donnell Heights high-rise projects. Come across a lady who looks depressed, and I ask her what's wrong, and she said they burglarized her home. And I asked her who was investigating the case, and she said, nobody. I didn't call the police. I'm like, why not? She said, y'all don't care about people down here. And I asked her, she had her head down. I asked her to look up. I said, ma'am, look at me. I care.
Right.
So we go into her apartment, and there's no furniture at all. There's nothing. So I asked, well, are you redecorating? She said, you don't understand. They stole everything. My food out of my refrigerator, my clothes, my furniture, my laundry detergent, the clothes off my clothesline. They have completely cleaned her house out. So I was a rookie, so I kind of took up information. I grew up in Baltimore and figured someone saw it like I saw it.
Yeah, of course.
So I started preliminary investigation, walk past the house. Well, first of all, I interview people. Nobody's seen anything for us. I walk past the house, I look inside, and I still remember to this day, I saw a refrigerator ornament she described, her leather coat, her Bible, her child's wagon, and I was able to find out who burglarized her house, get the property back, and make 2 arrests in it. And once I did that, word got around in the neighborhood. There was a young police officer who cared about the community, and people started coming to me with their unsolved cases. And at that point, I realized that was my calling. Law enforcement was my calling.
And how old were you at that point as a sort of a young officer?
21 years old.
Wow.
2
Okay.
years after the
Okay.
incident.
Wow, that's amazing. Now, that actually is sort of a perfect segue into my next question, which is, did you find that there was sort of a social or, kind of moral conflict? You're this young Black officer in O'Donnell Heights. I'm very well aware of that area, right? So, like, what is that like to sort of police these Black neighborhoods, and you grow up, you're a Black man in Baltimore City, and also you're dealing with, these type of situations where then you're kind of seen as a part of the community, but also outside of it as a police officer, and especially during, like you said, you're during the crack cocaine times in the 80s, in the late 80s. So, like, what is that conflict like for you?
Yeah, it's very difficult because some people in the community really look at you as an enemy.
Right.
As the police is an invading army that's there to violate their rights. But it takes, the reason why I ended up on foot patrol was I told my sergeant I want to be a detective. And that landed me right in O'Donnell Heights high-rise projects, and eventually Lafayette and Flag House projects.
Wow. Okay.
And because he knew the value of getting to know people in the community. So after about walking foot patrol for 6 months, my sergeant asked me, he said, Maurice, how many people you know down here? I said, I know everybody. He said, that was the point.
Yeah.
And people got to know me. They call me by Maurice instead of Officer Hicks. They got to know me basically on a first name basis. And that's where I was able to establish trust with people in the community. But again, it's difficult. They see somebody walk around, you're part of the establishment, so to speak.
Yeah.
It takes time to get to know people.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. The notion of sort of the beat cop, has that kind of gone away? It seems like it's not nearly as prevalent as it used to be.
It certainly has, and I'm so glad that I started in Baltimore, walking a foot beat, because I really learned how to interact with people, get to know their problems. I wasn't someone just rolling in like when I was a county officer, where officers were used to just rolling in their nice police cars and not really interacting with the public. So I took that same style of policing with me. I went to Prince George's County, which allowed me to become a detective and it allowed me to be able to solve a lot of cases.
Yeah. Now, outside of the sort of shoe leather policing of Baltimore City that you did, and when you went to Prince George's County, what is the difference that you found between those 2 areas? Was it wildly different or largely the same?
Largely the same, in the sense that crime, it was Prince George's County much nicer, but they had the same type of crime as in the city. Yeah. But they have fewer police officers. In my view, a lack of understanding of people in the community, because you're patrolling such large areas, you really don't get to know people. You have to really want to get to know people, because you're running from call to call, and you're not having the interactions you would have like in the inner city police department, walking a foot beat.
Right. Yeah, and it's funny because I think oftentimes it's seen as, city problems and county problems are diametrically opposed, which is, especially not at that time, was certainly not true. I'm always very interested in the idea of community policing, just from the perspective of, you should know these officers who are walking around, because then you do feel more comfortable, saying, hey, I actually do need help, instead of seeing these people as complete outsiders. So I do appreciate that experience that you have. And I hope that people read this book and actually realize that having Officer Maurice Hicks walking around and knowing who he is does make a dramatic difference in how things go in your communities. So it makes sense. Policing is notably one of the hardest jobs. I don't think anybody would, however you feel about police officers, I think everybody can acknowledge it's pretty tough. Did you find, whether in the field or sort of once you became a detective where you weren't actually walking the beat necessarily, did you find yourself in situations that even surprised you, kind of like looking back, like, I can't believe I was here, or, I was dealing with these kind of things? As you look back?
Absolutely. The things that our citizens go through living under siege, like I did growing up in Baltimore, is devastating. I was involved in a lot of high profile cases. One particular case, it was a drug dealer who I met when I was a rookie officer on my beat, who ended up becoming a drug kingpin, and was suspected of 12 murders. And I went from being a rookie patrol officer to major narcotics, to homicide, and then to the FBI in the pursuit of this individual who pretty much was wreaking havoc in several communities, and also Washington, D.C. and Annapolis. So, but it was the relationship with people in the community allowed me to be able to, work on solving those very important cases. Those relationships paid dividends for me throughout my career.
Right. And for the community, right? It's like getting somebody who's potentially responsible for 12 murders off the street is no small feat, I'm sure. Can you talk about the FBI Homicide Task Force, how you came to be on that?
Yeah, it's pretty interesting. I was at the time, of course, like I said, I knew this individual from when I was a patrol officer as a rookie.
Yeah.
And the police department's at a loss to what to do with him, because the best of the best detectives, station detectives, homicide detectives, narcotics detectives have worked to try to catch this individual. And I had an open case investigation because I was about to get promoted to sergeant. And I said, before I get promoted, I want to catch this guy. Yeah. So the chief of detective calls down to Major Narcotics and calls the lieutenant, our commander, and he says, Lieutenant, so tell me, which one of your hot shots is working this guy? They said he's a big drug dealer, that he's been killing people in the community for years with impunity. So tell me, Lieutenant, who do you have investigating this case? Lieutenant told me he was sweating bullets. He went to the computer and he typed in the suspect's name, and my name popped up in red. And so he tells me this later, and he calls me in his office, and he said, Maurice, he said, he told me the story of what happened to the chief detective. He said, and all these guys who think they're God's gift to narcotics wants to go to homicide to work this case. But you, the only one who had an active investigation, so you're going to homicide. So I went to homicide, and when they realized the magnitude of how dangerous the individual was, the FBI wanted to get involved in it. And because I had this background with I knew these guys, the suspects, the people being murdered, because I had such a strong background, I basically led the task force. I had so much institutional knowledge of this organization. So that's how I got to work on I got sworn as the FBI agent to work on the case.
Interesting. And how long were you on the task force?
Almost 3 years.
Wow, to get this one guy.
Yes.
Amazing. And I assume he's long and put away. So that's great.
Your viewers will have to read the book to find out.
Okay. All right. Fair enough. Fair enough. All right. Look, hey, we're talking a book here. No problem. You talked earlier about the humanity of police, right? The humanity of the people behind the badge, which I think is important. Do you find that when people come in as police officers, do they realize that there is a level of humanity behind the people that they're dealing with, as far as the citizens? Like, do you find that some people come in and are like, these people are all like this, and then they kind of learn a little bit more, and their views are shaped from the job as well?
Well, I think it really, some do and some do not. The short answer, some do and some do not.
Sure.
When you grow up, as I did in the neighborhood, you have a better understanding of, obviously. But I can say I had my field training officer, who was an African American. My second one, the first one you have to read, he's pretty interesting. But my second training officer, I got a few days later, really amazed me because he was a 20-year veteran who worked patrol his entire career.
Okay.
And he instilled in me as a rookie the importance of having compassion for people. And I took a lot of lessons that he taught me with me up throughout my whole career. And I was really amazed at his compassion for poor people. You know, he told me a lot about using discretion, not just writing people tickets because you can write tickets. So my field training officer and my sergeant were pretty much cut from the same mold. You know, my sergeant also was an African American. His mother lived in the neighborhood that we patrolled. So it was, he had a best interest. And he also had the same attitude, he believed in helping people. He really had a strong commitment. I think for me, it helped me a lot in my career because I had a good foundation with my training officer and my sergeant. And I was really impressed. It opened my eyes to something I hadn't seen growing up in Baltimore with my interaction with law enforcement.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very easy, whichever side you're on, right? It's very easy to not see the humanity in, whether it's the people you're dealing with as a police officer or vice versa. So it's good to know that there are police officers who are realizing that we're only getting better together in this, right? It's not us versus police or police versus the community. It's like these are not mutually exclusive perspectives. So I appreciate that, and I'm glad you had a person like that sort of instilled that in you and move further. And I'm sure there are other officers who have also learned this lesson. So, and then, well, you hope it's more than not for both sides, right?
And there's also a culture of people who family members have been in the police department for years, and they don't come in with the same attitude about community service. I'll just put it that way. And some do have us against. I talk about this in the book. Some have us against them mentality, and they pass it on to other people, that come on the police department, and that's a problem.
Yeah, I mean, do you find when you hear about how people see policing, do you find that they're missing a lot of what it is to be a police officer? When you hear people say, "Oh, cops are like this, X, Y, Z," it's got to, to me, like I have an IT background. When I watch television and people are talking about computer things, sometimes I'm like, please stop, because you don't know all of the other things that it is to be in that world. So I have to imagine, what is that like for you when you hear these things? Or some of them you're like, yeah, that's sadly true about some of this stuff.
I could say both. Again, a lot of the good things a police officer do is never publicized. Right. I talk about that in the book too. I've saved lives and never made the news many times, even in a uniform. But there are some people, we need to do a better job of policing ourselves over the years, or we wouldn't be in the position we're in now, where there's a lack of, confidence in the police. But it is a very difficult job. You have to make a split-second decision about your life that's going to be viewed by people and scholars and everything else. But we don't have the luxury of just walking away. We're the first line of defense for the community.
Yeah. I think that trying to understand other people's perspectives, especially in situations like things where you're making split-second decisions and things like that, I think that is very helpful for people to not make such, stereotypical responses, I guess. And again, that goes, both ways, and just understanding that we are all living in a world that is complex, right, and requires nuance. So, thank you for that. Since retiring, have you seen? Do you think you've seen progress? Since obviously things are very different than they were during the crack cocaine height. But have you seen, like, just as an outsider looking in now, have you seen any sort of progress that you think things are getting substantially better? Do what is it like being a police officer, or a retired police officer, sort of looking at the world now?
I think things are getting better, but the progress is still very slow in my view.
Sure.
We still have a long way to go, but it's difficult to change the culture in policing.
Yeah.
It's beginning to change, and the accountability in policing, and that's the main thing. The main problem I have is I see an officer gets involved in a critical incident, then we find out he or she has a pattern of behavior, but there's only two people, if any, that's held accountable. Normally it's the officer and the chief.
Right.
You have all these sergeants and lieutenants in between who know that these patterns exist, but nothing ever happens to them. They're never held accountable. And until other officers, supervisors, commanders' career are tied to some of these officers under their command who, be involved in so much misconduct, then it's going to be difficult to change.
Okay. Yeah, fair enough. I have one one interesting question for you. As you mentioned that, what are your thoughts on sort of like the qualified immunity sort of thing, right? So this idea that officers can be held sort of liable if things go awry. Do you have any perspective on that?
Yeah, it's going to make police officers afraid to do their job, and that's the last thing you want,
Right.
But I can understand it, the thought behind it, because I've known officers who have had excessive force complaint and sued several times, and they don't care if it's not paying out of their pocket.
Right.
The police department pays it. So, but the last thing you want is having the community suffer because of officers are afraid to do their job.
Okay. I think that's a fair perspective, honestly. Yeah. I really do. So I do want to ask you one last thing, which is, this is the chicken box. So the idea is get on the box and you sort of speak your truth. So I'll leave it to you. Like, what's the thing you want people to sort of take away from not only just reading Looking for Trouble, your book, but also the idea of being a Black police officer in Baltimore City?
Yes, and Prince George's County.
And
there's two struggles. There's a struggle against the violent criminals, and there's a struggle from internal politics, and people don't want to see you succeed. So in my book, I describe it's two battles brewing during this 10 years that I talk about in the book, and both were gaining momentum. Battle on the streets and battle from people within the department.
Right. Okay. All right. So I will end it there, and I'll just say this. Maurice, thank you for your book. It's super interesting. Bit of, I would say, probably the tip of the iceberg of what it is like to be a police officer in Baltimore City and in Prince George's County. And I would say that it is incredibly beneficial to everybody to understand that there are not just a single perspective in this whole thing, right? There is nuance and there is complexity to being a police officer, and I'm sure it's not all fun and games, right? It's not all TV show type of things, but it's also can be very difficult. And I think understanding people, as you said, and I have written down here, sort of the humanity behind the badge and the humanity behind the citizens that you work with and work for, I think is incredibly important. So thank you, Maurice. I appreciate it. You guys can check out Maurice's book, Looking for Trouble. It's up on the screen. It's on Amazon right now. So thank you.
Thank you very much for having me.
All right.